Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Ancient Philosophy Podcast. I'm Doug Campbell, an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at Alma College in Michigan, and I'm also the host of the Ancient Philosophy Podcast, which is the podcast that explores important topics in ancient philosophy, whether that's in China or India or Greece or Rome or the Near East or beyond. And in today's episode, we're going to be tackling an important question about Aristotle's philosophy, namely, what does Aristotle think human nature is like? Does he think it's good or bad or something else? Before we dive into answering that question directly, it's important to say something about the context in which we're asking this question and the context in which Aristotle answers this question. Because the book that contains the answer we're going to look at, which is the Nicomachean Ethics, also explores other questions like what is happiness, what is virtue, what is vice, what is the value of pleasure in a human life, and so on. And it's in that context that Aristotle answers the question, is human nature good or bad? So, in the Nicomachean Ethics, for instance, he lays out his theory that human happiness depends on the use of reason to regulate our emotions and the use of our goods, such as our money. And it's specifically in relation to that we're going to look at whether what human nature is like, because Aristotle thinks that the good use of our goods, the good use of our money, for example, or the well regulation of our emotions by reason, that's an important aspect of what it means to be good. That good people regulate their emotions in accordance with what's appropriate. And Aristotle really does think that there's an objective fact about each situation, whether fear is appropriate or whether fear is inappropriate, about whether anger is appropriate or whether calmness is appropriate. Aristotle thinks there's an objective fact about every situation, and we have to use our reason to regulate our emotions. Good people are people who, among other things, do that work of regulating their emotions well. So when we're asking whether human nature is good or bad, we're asking a question about human nature lending itself to the appropriate regulation of our emotions and so on. And of course, there's a lot more to happiness than just this, and Aristotle knows that. More than just the appropriate regulation of our emotions and more than just the appropriate use of our goods, such as money. Aristotle thinks we also need friendship to be happy, and there's some other things that he thinks we need. But a very big part of being happy is the use, as I've been saying, the use of reason to bring our emotions in line, specifically to bring them in line with what's appropriate to each circumstance. A courageous person is not going to run away from a chihuahua who wants cuddles. There's an objective fact about that situation that says running away is inappropriate. A lot of fear is inappropriate. But he or she will run away from a T-Rex. Why? Because there's an objective fact about that situation that says you run away as fast as you can from a Tyrannosaurus Rex. We can't say whether running away is courageous or cowardly until we know more about the situation and more about the people in the situation. If I regulate my emotion of fear such that I never get afraid and never run away, I run the risk of being reckless and rash when I see a T-Rex charge at me. That's when I need to run away. Fear is appropriate in that situation. And that's why we need to think about this fact when we're asking, well, what's human nature? Is it good or bad for Aristotle, or is it something else? The reason why that's so important is Aristotle thinks that both our emotions and our reason, our rationality, are part of what it means to be a human. Their emotions and rationality are both ineliminable parts of being a human being. They cannot be eliminated. That's a very controversial thing that Aristotle thinks. There are a lot of people, both in the ancient world and today, who think of emotions as defects of our rationality, defects of human nature, and that a perfectly rational person would have no emotions. The Stoics in the ancient world thought that emotions were generally, there might be a few exceptions, but generally were the results of irrational beliefs, or some Stoic philosophers thought that emotions were irrational beliefs themselves. But generally it was thought by the Stoics that emotions were the consequences of irrational beliefs, and then a perfectly rational person would have their emotions be eliminated. Aristotle thinks that not only would it be impossible to eliminate emotions, but it would also be undesirable to eliminate emotions, because there's an objective fact about each situation that says, for me, given the person I am, given the type of person I should not run away. Or there's an objective fact about a situation that says, me, given the person I am, given the type of person I am, I really should run away. And I should feel an appropriate amount of fear in the situations where I'm running away. And of course, it might be different from person to person too, right? As I said, it depends on facts about who I am too. Am I a trained Navy SEAL, in which fully armed, in which case, someone trying to mug me might not inspire, should not inspire the same kinds of fear that that situation would inspire in a 90-year-old unarmed grandma. That the facts about who we are change how much of an emotion is appropriate. But Aristotle does think that a rational person would actually feel a lot of fear when running away from a T-Rex. And that's a big difference between Aristotle and the Stoics. The Stoics think that fear is not something the virtuous, perfectly rational person would ever feel or should ever feel. That emotion totally gets eliminated. Aristotle is operating with a certain view of human nature where emotions and rationality are built into being a human being, and they're not in competition, nor should they be in competition, at least in the ideal situation, right? After all, there are situations where I really shouldn't be afraid, but I am. And in that situation, rationality might be telling me, you really shouldn't feel fear in this situation. But of course, my emotions are getting the best of me, and I actually do feel fear. That's a real possibility. So that's a situation where the demands of rationality and our emotions actually are in conflict with each other. But the Stoics believe that in the good case, the emotion of fear doesn't exist at all. And Aristotle believes that for the virtuous person, fear does exist and actually should exist. And so that's what Aristotle thinks of what we call the character virtues. There is another kind of virtue in Aristotle, the intellectual virtues, which won't really be a part of this episode, but I will say something about why later on. But Aristotle thinks that there's a kind of virtue called a character virtue that we have when we have successfully brought our emotions in line with reason. So if we're talking about the virtue of courage, that would mean that I've brought my feeling of fear in line. Now, that means that in some situations, fear is eliminated. I don't feel any fear. But in some situations, I will feel fear, but I'll always feel the appropriate amount of fear. Is this a chihuahua running at me? If so, no fear, right? It just wants cuddles, no fear. But if it's a T-Rex, I will feel fear, but I'll feel the appropriate amount of fear. And there are all sorts of things in between, right? Situations where there might be a roller coaster, and it's my first time on a roller coaster, and so it's unfamiliar to me. Is so much fear that I'm in the fetal position, crying in the corner. Is that amount of fear appropriate? No way. But is some amount of fear appropriate? Yeah, of course. It's a new experience for me. It's totally normal that I feel some amount of fear before I go on my first roller coaster. The bigger the roller coaster, the more fear is appropriate. But that doesn't mean any old amount of fear is appropriate, right? Just that doesn't mean that. But still, that doesn't mean that any feeling of fear is appropriate. There's still an excess that's possible, and that would not be virtuous. So courage is a great example of a character virtue. And there are tons of other character virtues for our soul. There's a character virtue for every feeling, even if we can't name it. Even if we can't name the feeling or name the relevant vice, there's still a character virtue for it. But there are also other kinds of virtues for Aristotle, namely the intellectual virtues, but they're not really relevant to what we're talking about. But I'm going to say something about them later. So when we have this view of virtues in mind, right, the character virtues such as courage in mind, we might wonder, are human beings naturally virtuous or naturally vicious? Is human nature good or bad? Did the virtues come to us naturally or not? And Aristotle addresses that important question in the Nicomachean Ethics. So here's a short version of his answer that I can say pretty plainly. Humans are naturally neither good nor bad. They're neither good nor bad naturally. But to see why and to understand his view more fully, we have to investigate what exactly he says in the Nicomachean Ethics about this topic. So I'm going to read this passage. This is from Book 2, Chapter 1. So Nicomachean Ethics 2:1. It's also clear that none of the character virtues arises in us by nature, for nothing that exists by nature can form a habit contrary to its nature. For instance, the stone which by nature moves downwards cannot be habituated to move upwards, not even if one tries to train it by throwing it up 10,000 times. Nor can fire be habituated to move downwards, nor can anything else that by nature behaves in one way but be trained to behave in another. Neither by nature, then, nor contrary to nature, do the virtues arise in us. Rather, we are adapted by nature to receive them and are made perfect by habit. End quote. Firstly, when Aristotle talks about character virtues in this passage, he means the character virtues associated with the proper regulation of our emotions. So that's what Aristotle's talking about here, is just what I've been leading up to this passage by saying that, Aristotle says in this passage, none of the character virtues arises in us by nature, neither contrary to nature do the virtues arise in us. And what he means is character virtues associated with proper regulation of our emotions. Courage is the trait we have when we properly regulate the emotion of fear. We could say the same thing about other feelings, stinginess, anger, and so on. We have a virtue when these are properly regulated. Secondly, in this passage, Aristotle mentioned habituation. That's a process of ingraining a new habit in us. Aristotle thinks that we can form habits by repeatedly practicing a behavior. Want to play a new sport really well? Practice it. Want to learn the guitar? Practice it. Want to have the virtues of courage and generosity? Practice them. Habituation is that process of repeated practice. So what Aristotle is saying in this passage is that if we were naturally one way, we wouldn't be able to habituate ourselves to be naturally the other way. So let's say that we thought that humans were naturally bad, and it can sometimes seem that way. Even a shallow, superficial survey of history reveals unfathomably bad atrocities committed by apparently normal people. But if humans were naturally bad, then we wouldn't be able to habituate ourselves to be good. And that's the point of his analogies with rock and fire. Rocks naturally move downwards. When we throw them up, they fall down. They can't be trained or habituated into doing anything by nature different. Of course, human intervention can cause rocks to go up, but that's different from saying that you've changed the nature of the rock. Fire, meanwhile, naturally goes up, and you similarly can't train it to do anything different. Yet humans are not naturally inclined towards being, say, just or unjust. The result, humans can be trained or habituated into being just. And the same can be said for courage, generosity, calmness, and so on. If we were naturally bad, we would be doomed to forever be bad because we wouldn't be able to change that fact. Now, what about the possibility that human nature is good? Well, we can run the same argument in reverse. Some people become bad over the course of their lives. If humans were naturally good, we wouldn't be able to explain that. If we were born good, we would be doomed to be good, so to speak. Though, of course, it's crazy to think of someone who's doomed to be good. That's a weird use of the verb doomed here. But the point is that if we were born good, Aristotle thinks we would be doomed to be good. Just as we can't change a rock's natural downward movement, we wouldn't be able to make ourselves bad if we were born good. There's a lot more to say about this reasoning, but let's pause for a second and take stock of what Aristotle's point is. Aristotle's point is that we're born kind of sort of blank slates. Now, I'm not saying Aristotle would deny that some things may be and some things might be innate in us. That's not my point. But my point is that when I use the word blank slate, I mean that we are neither good or bad by nature. We're neither naturally good nor bad. And the point Aristotle is getting at here is that, or rather, his main piece of evidence is that we can be trained to be either good or bad. We can be trained to be either good or bad. So when we think about this process of training, which Aristotle calls habituation, we should think about this using the examples I mentioned earlier. You're learning a new sport, you got to practice it. You want to play the guitar, learn to practice it. But when you're just starting to play the guitar, each movement feels really, really, really unnatural to you. Unnatural. And when you're just learning to play a sport, every motion feels unnatural to you. It feels like there's a lot of stimuli. You've got your attention is being pulled in a bunch of directions. Your body is moving in ways you might not have known it was possible to move in. And it seems as far from natural as possible. Okay? Far from natural as possible. And so you might say, man, this is never going to work out for me. This is never going to work out for me. But what gets you from point A to point B? What gets you from the unskilled guitarist or the unskilled wrestler to the wrestler whose movements are natural to them? Or what gets you from the unskilled guitarist to being the guitar virtuoso? Well, it's practice. And eventually, you will say something like, wow, these movements are like second nature to me. And you'll say that because the movements flow from you and flow from who you are naturally. How did you get there? You got there by practice. And Aristotle thinks that that's what we mean when we talk about habituation. Habituation works not just with the virtues, the character traits, but also with other things like playing a sport, learning a language, playing the guitar. You simply have to practice. That's why Aristotle's view is sometimes called very cutely the fake it till you make it sort of view. And the reason for that is that you start off being a bad guitarist, but by quote unquote pretending to be a guitarist, by practicing and practicing and practicing, you will eventually get there. And that's what Aristotle thinks the key to success is when it comes to virtues as well as all these other things, habituation. It also does mean that Aristotle conceives of having a virtue as having a habit. And the nice thing about the virtues for Aristotle is that eventually you reach a point where you stop straining yourself to perform a virtuous action. Anyone can do a courageous action, he thinks. Anyone can do a courageous action. Even a very cowardly person can do something courageous. But for the courageous person, the action is going to come naturally to them. It's going to flow from their nature. It's going to flow from their personality. They're just going to do it, maybe even without thinking about it. And they're certainly not going to have a bunch of inner conflict about it. But a cowardly person could do the same courageous action, but for them, they might be conflicted. They might find it unpleasant. They might have had to deliberate about it. They might need a bunch of people coaching them how to do it. Now, that might all be, those actions might all be necessary steps for becoming courageous, but still they feel contrived, strained. You have to put a lot of effort to make them happen. And the courageous person doesn't really have to do that. But don't be confused. The courageous person might feel that the action is natural to them, and the cowardly person might feel the courageous action is unnatural to them. But as a matter of fact, the courageous person wasn't born with this nature. They achieved it through habituation, through repeated practicing. And the cowardly person the cowardly person might say the action is unnatural to them, but it was not contrary to their nature. They just haven't built themselves up in the right way yet. But what Aristotle thinks is so important about this is that habituation is a process we can undergo even when we feel like the action is deeply foreign to us. It's not foreign to our nature in the sense that our nature is opposed to this. It's rather just that we haven't built up our nature in the right way. Our nature is such that it can go in either direction. So that's why Aristotle thinks human nature is neither good nor bad naturally. So one big thing that Aristotle wants to highlight here is habituation and the way that we can train ourselves to be good or bad in a way that rocks can never be trained to do anything other than go down. Of course, we can, through human intervention, make a rock go up, but that's different from what we're talking about when we talk about having changed the rock's nature. And besides, the rock is still going to come down anyway. Now, there's also another important fact that Aristotle highlights, which is that humans don't naturally tend towards good behaviors. We know that rocks have a natural movement downwards because we see that in the absence of our intervention, rocks go down. We can observe that upward movement is similarly natural in fire. Now, a fire goes up naturally, rock go down naturally, but it doesn't take a keen observer of humanity to recognize that generosity and courage are not so easy. So if humans were naturally good, then habituation would be entirely unnecessary because we'd already have the character traits that we want and the character traits that we, of course, I don't have to highlight this very much, but the character traits we actually observe many people lacking, right? We see very plainly that humans don't naturally tend towards good behaviors. So Aristotle thinks we can rule that one out. But if you were to come back and say, well, if humans were naturally bad, then habituation would be futile because acquisition of the virtues would be impossible. It would simply be impossible to become good if we were naturally bad. And so that's how Aristotle approaches this question. But there's a bit of a complication here. And that's because rocks are also neither courageous nor cowardly by nature. And we're obviously not like rocks. We can become courageous, whereas rocks never can become courageous. And so I'm going to read off the last sentence of the passage I quoted earlier from Nicomachean Ethics, Book 2, Chapter 1. We are adapted by nature to receive them, i.e. the character virtues, and are made perfect by habit, end quote. This is what the passage means. Our nature, while neither good nor bad, is the kind of neither good nor bad that allows us to develop the virtues. Rocks are neither courageous nor cowardly in an entirely different way. They could never become courageous ever, nor could they ever become cowardly ever. But human nature is such that we can become courageous if we put in the effort. How? By habituation. In other words, by repeatedly practicing courageous actions. Eventually, we'll start regulating our emotions accordingly. What at first seems scary won't seem so scary anymore. Earlier, when I said that Aristotle thinks that we are like blank slates, I made sure to say it's not like he thinks we're totally blank slates. Like he does think that there is something to human nature. And I really want to highlight that. When I said earlier that Aristotle thinks we're like blank slates, I don't mean in every respect. I just mean that Aristotle thinks that we're like blank slates, specifically with respect to the question of whether we're good or bad. But he does think that there is some stuff, some content to human nature, and that content is the thing that makes us different from whatever the rock nature is or whatever the fire nature is. The human nature is such that we are adapted to receive the virtues and we can perfect that by habit. Habit completes what's already there by nature. There is a thing, human nature, and this is the thing that we adapt when we become virtuous, or for that matter, we can squander it and let it become vicious, let ourselves become vicious. But Aristotle thinks that this is a little bit like when you are talking about a guitarist, right? We are neither guitarists by nature, nor are we opposed to becoming a guitarist by nature. But some people have a particular gift to become a guitarist, and that gift is something that's perfected by habit, by practice. And Aristotle thinks that we're born with, as human beings, we're born with a nature that is such that we can develop it by habituation, by practicing. So generosity, for example, isn't natural to us, but can become second nature through practice or habituation. That means that our nature is the sort of thing that can be adapted or can adapt in order to receive the virtues in accordance with the practice we subject it to, right? Our nature is neither generous nor stingy, but it is the sort of thing that can be adapted to receive these character traits: stinginess, which would be a vice, or generosity, which would be a virtue. That is the important Aristotelian idea here, that our nature, there is such a thing called human nature that can go in either direction, towards a virtue or towards a vice. It doesn't mean we're nothing. It just means that we are a sort of thing that is malleable and can be molded. With that in mind, we can now see more clearly what Aristotle thinks our nature is like, the way that it's neither good nor bad, and why he thinks that this is the case. There are a few other points that I'll make, some small points. One point is that I don't want to say that habituation, and Aristotle doesn't want to say that habituation is the only important factor here, that it's the end all and be all. Habituation is the process. Habituation is the process by which we come to perfect what is in us by nature. It's how we actually receive the relevant character traits. Hopefully, we're habituating ourselves to be good rather than habituating ourselves to be bad, because we could also habituate bad habits too, right? We could also, just as we can practice being generous, we can practice being stingy. And that's an important fact. But habituation is not the only relevant factor here. Aristotle does put a lot of emphasis in the Nicomachean Ethics on upbringing, that you have to be born into the right sort of institutions and societies, the right sort of political communities, what Greeks would have called a polis, or in the plural, polis. And Aristotle thinks many people are just born in bad polis. They're not born in the correct polis. And the reason for that is that they don't have the right laws. In ancient Greek political philosophy, especially for Plato and Aristotle, Plato being Aristotle's teacher, especially for in ancient Greek philosophy, there's a major emphasis being put on the laws as a moral education. The laws help shape a person's character morally. And if you're born in the wrong polis that has bad laws, that can contribute to our bad upbringing. If you have bad parents too, that can contribute to a bad upbringing. And the idea is that because Aristotle thinks that we're malleable, our natures are molded by repeated behaviors. If the law is encouraging you to engage in the wrong behaviors, you're going to have the wrong character traits develop, the wrong habits. And similarly, if the law is encouraging you to practice the right sorts of things, you're going to have good behaviors. You're going to have good repeated behaviors and thus develop the right character traits. Of course, ultimately, there's a mechanism here for how you become good or bad for that matter, and that's habituation. So the point about upbringing and laws and the polis that we're born into, I'm not saying that these take away from the importance of habituation, because ultimately the only relevant mechanism here, the only relevant mechanism of action is habituation. But habituation is not happening at the discretion of the individual exclusively. Of course, ultimately we do eventually need to put in our own agency here and have the right sorts of deliberative practices. So there's individual agency plays a huge role for Aristotle. But like, you spend a huge part of your life existing at the whims of your parents, and some behaviors are going to be off limits according to the law. And like that's a major factor that Aristotle wants to heed here. So I'm not saying um, habituation is the end of the story. It's still the only real mechanism of action, but that habituation's happening within a context that Aristotle really does want to pay attention to. Another important point I want to mention is that habituation works for some virtues, but not all the virtues. I mentioned this earlier that, like, when I talk about virtues, there are more than just the character virtues, there are intellectual virtues too. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this topic because intellectual virtues just aren't that relevant here. But it is worth saying that intellectual virtues are not developed by habituation. I did a whole episode on the difference between character virtues and intellectual virtues in Aristotle that you can go back and listen to, where I say more about what intellectual virtues are. But whereas character virtues are just characterized by the correct regulation of an emotion by reason, so you brought an emotion in line with what the situation calls for. Intellectual virtues are instead pieces of knowledge or information. Intellectual virtues are therefore learned. They are not ingrained in a person by habituation. They are acquired just as much as character virtues are. So, in a way, we could still say exactly the same things we said about character virtues here. You're not born wise, but you are born the sort of thing that can become wise, where the relevant process of becoming wise is not habituation, but is learning. So it's not like the discussion of the intellectual virtues would change anything about this episode. But when Aristotle's talking about human nature in Book 2, Chapter 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, he's talking about habituation and character virtues because that's really what we're interested in when we're talking about human nature being either good or bad, right? We're not asking, are you born wise? That's generally not what people mean. They mean something like, is human nature the sort of thing that's just or unjust, and so on. If you're wondering a little bit more about intellectual virtues, I've now given an example of one, which is wisdom. Wisdom is some knowledge we have. Aristotle thinks that it's knowledge of most, the best things among the things that are unchanging. There are other intellectual virtues too. There is an intellectual virtue for when you know the best thing among human things, among things that admit of change, that can be different. Aristotle thinks that some kinds of scientific knowledge are intellectual virtues too. That's a big example of an intellectual virtue for Aristotle. Generally, these are things that perfect our intellect, but that have nothing to do with. Generally speaking, intellectual virtues are the perfections of our intellect. They're what make our intellects be perfect, but they don't really have anything to do with our emotions. Another point to mention here is that I don't think that Aristotle believes that everyone is able to actually perfect human nature in the way that he lays out here. I am fairly confident in my assessment of that because Aristotle does believe some people are just doomed. I've already actually given an example of one set of such people, namely people born in bad polis. If you're born in a society with bad laws, or if you're born to people who will raise you badly, you are just doomed. And Aristotle thinks that's true, that some people are just doomed. More controversially, Aristotle would say the same thing about women. His comments about women are kind of cryptic, but he says that women have a reason that lacks authority. That's probably the best translation of that. It's the best translation, in my opinion, at any rate, of a very vexed, difficult word, akurion, which literally means something like lacks authority. It's akurion would be the denial, the alpha there, the A at the start of that word is denying the word kurion, which would mean authority, related to a word meaning like a chief or a chieftain. And so Aristotle's saying that women have a rationality that is akurion, which very debated thing among scholars what it means to say that. It's not like he says a very 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 much about the subject, so we really have to piece together his thoughts from this, again, very vexed adjective. But the idea seems to be that women are capable of thinking, but that their deliberations don't really stick. Women are able to think and they have rationality, but their rationality isn't authoritative in their life. It doesn't take command. This is, as you might have expected, this is leading to a situation where women cannot really be granted, in Aristotle's view, control over their own lives. And because they don't have control over their own lives, Aristotle thinks that they're not really going to be able to go through this complicated habituation process and be their own people who can perfect their skills and their habits and their emotions. If your rationality is not authoritative in you, probably it can't really take control of your emotions. Aristotle thinks similar things about people whom he deems natural slaves. I'm going to do an episode on natural slaves at some point to discuss this important theory that Aristotle develops in the Politics. But briefly, Aristotle thinks that some people are not suited by nature to be free. And because of that, they're suited to be slaves who are always going to be enthralled to someone else. They're always going to be in someone else's thrall. And this person, their master, is going to control them and basically use them as a tool, as one did with slaves. And for that reason, again, we have people who really, they're not going to be able to take control of their lives. So far are they going to be from having their reason take control of their lives that they're not even going to be able to take control of their lives. So Aristotle thinks that these are really three sets of people I've identified who are not going to be able to perfect their human nature. Again, these are people born in bad polis or otherwise just have bad upbringings. Maybe you're in a good polis or a sufficiently good polis, even if not perfect polis, but that you just have people who are going to give you a bad upbringing. Then we have women, and then we have people who are naturally suited to be slaves. I will end by saying that I'm not really that convinced by Aristotle's argument. I mean, it makes sense, and I understand his reasoning very well. And every time I go through his argument, I find it slightly more compelling because it is a very compelling argument. But I like to put him in position with other ancient thinkers who are from ancient China. So I've done an episode on Xunzi, a Confucian philosopher who believed that human nature was bad. And I'm not going to rehearse all of Xunzi's arguments here. He has multiple. But the biggest one is that cannot be human nature cannot be good and in fact is bad. And we know that because of the tremendous amount of deliberate effort required to become good. And I think that what Aristotle's view fails to compel me on, what it fails to convince me of, is that Aristotle thinks human nature is neither good nor bad. And look, we can just go in either direction depending on how we're habituated. But I wonder, why is it easier to become bad than it is good? Why is it easier to become bad rather than good? Like, Aristotle's arguments give the impression that we are evenly suspended between these 2 points, good and bad. And we just have to habituate ourselves more towards good than bad. And then we can become good. And Aristotle thinks we just have to move towards the good through habituation, and that's how we'll become good. And like, I get that at one level, but I wonder why it's easier for us to become bad than it is good. Now, Aristotle and Xunzi definitely share different conceptions of what it means for something to be natural in the first place. For instance, if we go back up to this point earlier, the Aristotle talks about the stone, right? The stone, which by nature moves downwards, cannot be habituated to move upwards, not even if one tries to train it by throwing it up 10,000 times, nor can fire be habituated to move downwards, nor can anything else that by nature behaves in one way be trained to behave in another way. Xunzi absolutely disagrees with that. For Xunzi, being naturally bad doesn't eliminate the possibility of being good. Because if Aristotle and Shunzi were speaking, and Aristotle merely heard Shunzi's conclusion that human nature is bad, Aristotle would say, well, then how on earth can we become good? Explain why there are virtuous people. Just habituate yourselves towards the good, and you'll become good. And Aristotle's point is right, so long as you so long as you believe. And Aristotle's point is right, so long as you buy his conception of nature. Aristotle's conception of nature comes from the elements that earth when earth naturally moves downwards, fire naturally moves upwards. Sure, you can intervene and throw a rock up and it will move up, but look, eventually it's going to come down. And besides, your human intervention hasn't changed the thing's nature. But Aristotle and Shunzi have different conceptions of nature because Shunzi is not going to buy that conception of nature. Shunzi thinks of our nature as our starting point. And I think that that allows him some more flexibility in his view. But if we're paying attention to their conclusions, right? Aristotle disagrees with Shunzi's conclusion because Aristotle thinks Shunzi's conclusion fails to explain why there are good people in the world. But if you pay attention to their conclusions, if you pay attention to Shunzi's argument, I think Shunzi's argument is a really compelling one because Shunzi explains by pointing to the deliberate effort required to be good. Shunzi explains why it's so much easier for a person to become bad than good. And I think that's the thing that Aristotle's view has a harder time describing or explaining. The question is not why are there good people? That's something Shunzi can explain. Why are there good people? Because they put in the effort. But why was so much effort required to become good? Whereas badness and vice just come more easily to us. It's so much easier to be stingy than it is to be generous. It's so much easier to be stingy than it is generous. Do I think that Shunzi refutes Aristotle completely? No, not at all. I bring this up at the end of the episode just to highlight something that I think is interesting about Aristotle's position. But I think that Aristotle might say something like, the only reason why I, the host of this podcast, find bad easier to be than good, the Aristotle would say that the only reason why I, the host of this podcast, find it easier to be bad than good is because of the society that I lived in. I'm trying to compensate for a bad upbringing and bad institutions. Of course I'm going to find it hard to become good. I was raised in a society where the laws play very little, if any, role in moral education. My parents spent a lot longer trying to make me stay alive than to make me be a good person. And even to the extent that my parents were trying to make me be a good person, they were not helped by society. Aristotle believes that it's important to have parents to have the backing of the law, among other things. And maybe if I had the law help me, I would have found being good a lot easier to be. And that I shouldn't infer from my own experience some universal human experience that in a good society, it's a lot easier to become good than I'm making it out to be. And that point is fair, is well taken. And I think that it shows you the richness and depth of Aristotle's view. And on that note, I shall end this episode. I point you to two earlier episodes, the episode on Shunzi on whether humans are good or bad, in which I point you to two other episodes, the episode on Shunzi where he argues that human nature is bad. I also point you to the episode on the difference between character and intellectual virtues. That's a big one that will shine a light on so many of the ideas that are in the background here of this episode. If you're interested in subscribing to the Ancient Philosophy podcast, you can do so wherever you find podcasts, such as Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You can also subscribe on YouTube for video episodes. I also have a Substack, platosfishtrap.substack.com. And I also have a book available for purchase, An Introduction to the Ethics of Social Media. And you can buy that wherever you buy books, such as Amazon. You can also purchase it through the publisher directly, Hackett. Thank you very much.